It was the silence that finally broke me, that October morning when I climbed the creaking stairs to my second-floor apartment for what I knew would be the last time I'd find my friend alive. I'd owned this multifamily house for nearly 6 years, a sprawling, temperamental structure built in 1805 that had seen more than its share of lives come and go through its weathered doorways. For almost 5 of those years, the upstairs belonged to a former co-worker who had slowly, organically, become something far more significant than a tenant. He'd become a fixture in my daily existence, a quiet presence whose footfalls overhead had become as familiar as my own heartbeat. In his early 40s, he carried the heavy burden of severe diabetes with a stoicism I'd always admired, never complaining about the relentless monitoring, the dietary restrictions, the constant vigilance his condition demanded. He was, by every conceivable measure, the ideal tenant. Rent always appeared in my account like clockwork. His existence upstairs was so unobtrusive that I often forgot he was there until I'd hear the soft strains of jazz drifting through the floorboards on Sunday mornings, or catch the faint aroma of whatever he was cooking for his meticulously managed meals. But he was also so much more than that, and somewhere along the way, the landlord-tenant dynamic had blurred into something resembling genuine friendship. He helped me patch the roof during that terrible nor'easter 2 winters ago, taught me how to properly bleed the radiators when they started clanking, and once spent an entire Saturday helping me rewire a faulty light fixture in the basement, his patient hands guiding mine through the process with a kind of gentle instruction that only comes from someone who genuinely cares. We'd share beers on the back porch during summer evenings, him nursing his single allowed drink while I'd go through 3 or 4, talking about everything and nothing. Work frustrations, the absurdity of local politics, the way the neighborhood had changed since we'd both moved in, our shared and unspoken loneliness that we acknowledged only through the comfortable silences that stretched between our words. He knew my ex-wife's name and never mentioned it. I knew he'd been engaged once, a decade ago, and never asked what happened. That's the kind of friendship we had, present, supportive, but always respecting the boundaries that made it work. Then, at the beginning of October, the rhythm broke. The first of the month came and went without the usual notification from my banking app, and at first I told myself it was just an oversight, a simple mistake that he'd correct as soon as he realized. He was always so meticulous, so reliable, and I'd grown so accustomed to his consistency that I didn't even feel a flicker of concern when the first day passed. The second day, I sent a casual text. "Hey, just checking in, rent's not showing up, let me know if everything's okay." No response. The third day, I called, let it ring until voicemail picked up, left a light-hearted message about the banks being slow and not to worry. The fourth day, I started to feel the first cold tendrils of unease curling in my stomach. I called again, texted again, and when neither received a reply, I went to the base of the stairs and called up, my voice echoing in the narrow staircase that had always seemed so welcoming and now felt suddenly, inexplicably foreboding. Nothing. No response, no movement, no sound of his television or the soft shuffle of his feet across the old wooden floors. The fifth day, I began banging on his door with more urgency than I'd ever shown, my knuckles reddening against the painted wood, calling his name until my throat felt raw. I pressed my ear against the door and heard nothing but the oppressive silence that seemed to have settled over the entire upstairs like a shroud. The sixth day, I made the decision I'd been dreading since that first missed payment. I found the spare key, the one we'd agreed I'd keep for emergencies, and I climbed those stairs one final time, my heart hammering against my ribs with each step, my mind racing through every possible explanation. Maybe he'd gone out of town unexpectedly, maybe his phone died, maybe he was in the hospital and couldn't reach out. Every rationalization I could muster was a desperate attempt to avoid what my gut already knew. The door swung open easily, silently, and the first thing that hit me was the smell, not the smell of death, not yet, but the smell of him, that indefinable scent that every person leaves behind in their living space, a combination of his particular soap, the faint sweetness of his diabetes medication, the lingering remnants of whatever he'd last cooked, the mustiness of an old house that had absorbed his presence over 5 years. It was so uniquely, unmistakably him that for a moment I almost believed he'd just stepped out for a moment, that he'd walk through the doorway any second with a bag of groceries and a sheepish apology for worrying me. I called his name again, my voice trembling now despite my best efforts to steady it, and the silence that answered me was somehow louder than any sound could have been. I walked through the living room, past the comfortable worn couch where we'd watched so many ball games together, past the small dining table where we'd shared meals during the holidays when neither of us had anywhere else to go, and I noticed the small details that my panicked brain was cataloguing with terrible precision. The half-empty glass of water on the coffee table, the book face down on the armchair, the television remote sitting at an angle that suggested it had been set down casually, not placed with intention. Everything was normal. Everything was exactly as it should be. Except for the silence. Except for the absence. I reached his bedroom door, and I paused, my hand hovering over the doorknob as if it were a live electrical wire, and I remember thinking with absurd clarity that I should have brought my phone, that I should have called someone before doing this, that whatever was on the other side of this door was going to change everything. I pushed the door open, and there he was. He was lying in his bed, the covers pulled up to his chest, his eyes open and staring at the ceiling with an expression that I still can't fully describe. Not peaceful, not pained, just vacant. Empty. The kind of emptiness that only comes when the person who once inhabited a body has departed, leaving behind only the shell that used to contain them. His skin had taken on a waxy, almost translucent quality, and his lips were slightly parted, and I knew instantly, with the kind of terrible certainty that bypasses all rational thought, that he was gone. He'd been gone for days, probably, his body slowly shutting down from a diabetic coma that had claimed him while he slept, while I was downstairs going about my ordinary life, oblivious to the fact that my friend was dying just a floor above me. I stood there for what felt like hours but was probably only seconds, my brain refusing to process what my eyes were showing me, my feet rooted to the floor as if I'd grown into the ancient wood beneath me. I called his name one more time, a whisper really, the desperate last plea of a man who can't accept what he's seeing, and then I turned and walked out, my legs moving mechanically, my mind a whirlwind of static and white noise. I called the police from the driveway, my hands shaking so badly I could barely punch in the numbers, and I sat on the cold concrete of the driveway as the autumn leaves drifted down around me, and I smoked an entire pack of cigarettes in about 2 hours, something I hadn't done in years. The police came, and the paramedics, and eventually someone from the medical examiner's office, and I answered their questions in a daze, signing forms I couldn't read, giving statements I couldn't remember making. And through all of it, I kept thinking about the last time I'd seen him alive, a week before, when he'd waved to me from his window as I left for work, a casual gesture that I'd returned without a second thought, never imagining it would be our final interaction. I thought about all the times I'd heard him moving around up there in the middle of the night, his insomnia a companion to my own, and I'd never once thought to check on him, never once considered that his silence might mean something more than just his characteristic quietness. I thought about the small kindnesses he'd shown me over the years, the way he'd always had a cup of coffee waiting when he knew I'd had a rough night, the way he'd helped me through my divorce without ever prying, the way he'd made me feel less alone in a house that had always been too big for one person. And I thought about how I'd found him, those open eyes staring at nothing, and I knew that image would be seared into my memory forever. The months that followed were a blur of logistics and avoidance. The house, old and demanding as it was, had always required constant attention, and the upstairs apartment had been in need of significant updates even before he'd moved in. Now, with his passing, the work had become unavoidable. The electrical system was outdated and borderline dangerous. The plumbing in the bathroom had developed a slow but persistent leak that was steadily dripping through the floor into my bathroom below, and the windows were so old and drafty that heating the space in winter was like trying to warm the outdoors. I'd always known I'd need to address these issues eventually, but I'd put them off year after year, finding one excuse after another, and now the consequences of my procrastination were bearing down on me like a freight train. The leak had been dribbling into my bathroom for months, a constant reminder of the work I needed to do, and I'd been ignoring it, letting the water stain the ceiling tiles and the plaster bubble and peel, because every time I thought about going upstairs, I felt a wave of nausea and dread that I couldn't overcome. I'd gone up there maybe 6 times in the 9 months since finding him, and each visit had been shorter and more fraught than the last. I'd stand at the bottom of the stairs, looking up at the doorway that led to his old apartment, and I'd feel my heart start racing, my palms sweating, my breath coming in shallow gasps that left me dizzy and disoriented. The first time I went up after his body was removed, I couldn't even make it past the living room. I'd stood in the doorway, looking at the couch where we'd spent so many evenings, and I'd burst into tears, ugly heaving sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than my lungs, somewhere primal and ancient and utterly inconsolable. The second time, I managed to make it into the kitchen, where I found a half-eaten box of crackers in the pantry and a carton of milk that had curdled so badly I could smell it from across the room. I'd thrown them away with shaking hands, trying not to touch anything else, trying not to think about the fact that he'd bought those crackers, that he'd poured that milk into his coffee that last morning, that he'd gone about his ordinary routine completely unaware that it would be his last. The third time, I'd made it to the bathroom, and I'd stood there for a long time, staring at the tub where he'd taken his showers, the mirror where he'd combed his hair, the small soap dish where he'd kept his medications, and I'd felt the strangest sensation, like he was still there, just in the other room, and if I called his name, he'd answer. I'd called his name, just to test the theory, and the silence that answered me was so profound, so absolute, that it felt like a physical weight pressing down on my chest. I'd fled downstairs and didn't go back up for 2 months. The fourth time, I went with a friend who'd offered to help me start sorting through his belongings, and even with someone else there, I couldn't bring myself to enter the bedroom. I stood in the hallway, looking through the open door at the room where I'd found him, and I could see the indentation in the mattress where his body had lain, the slight depression in the pillow where his head had rested, the small stain on the sheets that I knew was from his body's final release. My friend was kind, understanding, he didn't push or judge, he just quietly asked what I wanted him to do with the things in the living room, and I told him to donate whatever seemed useful and throw away the rest. I couldn't help. I couldn't participate. I just stood there in the hallway, trembling like a leaf in a storm, staring at that empty room and seeing him there over and over, those open eyes staring at nothing, that waxy skin, that terrible stillness. My friend handled the logistics that day, and I paid him back by buying him dinner and never speaking of it again. The fifth time, I'd gone up alone, determined to face my fear, to prove to myself that I was stronger than this, that I could reclaim this space and move forward. I'd made it into the living room, and I'd sat on the floor in the middle of the room, my back against the wall, and I'd tried to breathe through the panic that was rising in my chest like a tide. I'd closed my eyes and tried to picture the room the way it used to be, bright and warm, filled with his laughter and his quiet presence, the television playing some old movie, the smell of whatever he was cooking, the comfortable chaos of a life being lived. But every time I tried to hold onto that image, it would dissolve into the reality of what I'd seen, and I'd open my eyes and see the cobwebs that had started to form in the corners, the dust that had settled over everything, the emptiness that seemed to echo with the memory of what had been lost. I'd left after 10 minutes, my heart racing, my throat tight with unshed tears, and I'd promised myself I'd try again tomorrow. That was 4 months ago. I haven't been back since. The smell of him is still up there, somehow, impossibly. Not the smell of his body, not the terrible odor that I'd braced myself for when I first opened that door, but the smell of his life, the particular combination of his laundry detergent and his soap and his cooking and his presence. It's a smell that I can't quite describe to anyone who hasn't experienced it, a scent that is so intimately connected to a person that it feels like a violation to even acknowledge it, like smelling a ghost. Every time I even think about going upstairs, I remember that smell, and I feel a wave of grief so powerful that it literally takes my breath away. I'll be sitting in my living room, watching television, and I'll catch a whiff of something that reminds me of him, and I'll be right back in that moment, standing in his doorway, seeing his body, smelling his life mixed with the terrible knowledge of his death. It's a sensory experience that I can't escape, a trigger that has rewired my brain to associate anything related to that apartment with the trauma of finding him. And yet, I can't afford to avoid it. The financial reality of my situation is pressing down on me with the weight of a collapsing building. I lost my well-paying job about a year before he died, a victim of corporate downsizing that had nothing to do with my performance and everything to do with quarterly earnings reports, and I'd been forced to take a position that paid significantly less than what I was used to. The pay cut was substantial, a reduction of nearly 40%, but I'd convinced myself that I could make it work. I had the rental income from his apartment, I'd been reasonably careful with my savings, and the new job, while financially draining, was actually much better for my mental health in ways that I hadn't expected. I was working with people who appreciated me, my stress levels were lower, and I was doing work that I actually found meaningful. But the financial cushion that I'd been counting on was thinner than I'd realized, and when he died, when the rental income suddenly stopped, I found myself teetering on the edge of a financial precipice that I hadn't even known was there. The mortgage is my priority, the one bill I absolutely cannot miss, and I've been making it work through a combination of credit cards, payment plans, and the occasional sale of things I'd rather not part with. I've sold my car, downgraded to a beat-up old sedan that I bought for cash, and I've stopped eating out entirely, surviving on rice and beans and whatever else I can find on sale at the discount grocery store. I've let my gym membership lapse, cancelled my streaming services, and cut back on everything I possibly can, but the math still doesn't work. Every month, I'm just barely scraping by, my debt slowly but inexorably climbing, and I know that I can't keep this up forever. The solution is obvious: finish the renovations upstairs, find a new tenant, restore that income stream that had been my financial lifeline. But the solution requires me to go up there, to spend hours and hours in that space, to fix the leak and update the electrical and replace the windows and clean and paint and prepare for a stranger to move into the place where my friend died. I've tried to find ways around it. I've called contractors, explained my situation, asked if they could do the work and let me pay them over time, but the quotes I've gotten are astronomical, far beyond what I can afford even with a payment plan. I've looked into loans, but my credit has taken a hit from the missed payments and maxed out cards, and the interest rates I'm being offered would trap me in a cycle of debt that would be even worse than what I'm currently facing. I've considered selling the house entirely, just walking away from the whole mess and starting over somewhere else, but the market in my area is depressed, and I'd barely break even after paying off the mortgage and the realtor fees. The house is my only asset, the only thing I have to show for my years of hard work, and the thought of losing it feels like losing everything. I know I need therapy. I've known it since that October morning when I sat in my driveway and chain-smoked myself into a stupor. I know that what I'm experiencing is textbook trauma, that I'm displaying every symptom of post-traumatic stress disorder, that the avoidance and the anxiety and the intrusive thoughts are all classic signs that I need professional help. And I want to get that help, desperately, not just for this but for all the other things I've been carrying. The divorce that left me feeling like half a person, the financial stress that keeps me up at night, the loneliness that has become so familiar that I don't even notice it anymore. But therapy is expensive, and my health insurance is the worst kind of high-deductible plan that covers almost nothing until I've spent thousands out of pocket, and I'm already paying for other medical professionals. A psychiatrist for the depression that predates all of this, a physical therapist for the back injury that won't seem to heal, a dentist for the tooth that's been bothering me but that I can't afford to fix properly. Every time I think about adding therapy to that list, I do the math again and come up short. There's a cruel irony in all of this. The very thing I need to do to afford therapy is the one thing I can't bring myself to do. If I could just get past this, if I could just force myself to go up there and do the work, the rental income would give me the breathing room I need to find a therapist, to actually address the root of the problem, to start healing. But I can't get past this. I'm stuck in a loop of avoidance and anxiety, the walls closing in around me, and every day that I put off the work makes the situation worse. The leak gets more destructive, the dust gets thicker, the cobwebs get more extensive, and the memory of what I found up there gets more deeply etched into my consciousness. I've tried everything I can think of to break through this barrier. I've tried meditation, sitting in my living room and visualizing myself walking through the apartment with calm and purpose, but every time I get to the bedroom, my mind goes blank and I can't continue. I've tried exposure therapy, going up the stairs a little further each day, but I can't even make it past the first landing without feeling like I'm going to be sick. I've tried asking friends to help, but they have their own lives and their own problems, and the one or two who did come to assist quickly realized that I was more of a burden than a help, my presence making everything harder instead of easier. I've tried hiring someone to just go up there and do the work without me, but I can't afford the labor costs, and I'm too embarrassed to explain why I need someone else to do something I'm perfectly capable of doing myself. I've looked for support groups, thinking maybe if I could talk to other people who have been through something similar, I'd find the strength to move forward. There are groups for people who have lost loved ones, but most of them seem to be for families who lost someone gradually, to illness or old age, not for someone who found a friend's body in a spare bedroom. There are groups for first responders and medical professionals, people who see death regularly as part of their jobs, but I feel like an imposter in those spaces, my one-time trauma seeming insignificant next to their daily exposure. I've searched online for stories like mine, hoping to find someone who has navigated this particular nightmare and come out the other side. But the internet is vast and indifferent, and my searches keep bringing up either clinical articles about grief or true crime stories that only make me feel worse. The smell of him is still up there. I know this because the last time I went up, 4 months ago, I made it to the top of the stairs and stood in the doorway, and I could smell him, that indefinable scent of his life, and I knew that I couldn't go any further. I stood there for a long time, just breathing, trying to separate the memory from the reality, trying to tell myself that it was just a smell, just a collection of molecules that had nothing to do with him anymore, that he was gone and what I was smelling was just the residue of a life that had moved on. But it didn't work. The smell was too potent, too specific, too intimately connected to the person I'd lost. I closed the door and I walked away, and I haven't opened it since. The leak is getting worse. I can hear it from my bathroom at night, the steady drip 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 of water through the old pipes, a constant reminder of the work I'm not doing. The water stains on my ceiling are spreading, the plaster beginning to crumble, and I know that if I don't fix it soon, I'm going to be looking at a much more expensive repair. But every time I think about going up there, I feel that familiar wave of nausea, that tightness in my chest, that overwhelming urge to flee. I've started sleeping in my living room because my bedroom shares a wall with the bathroom, and the sound of the leak is too much to bear. I've started having nightmares, not about him specifically, but about being trapped, about walls closing in, about being unable to escape a situation that I know is of my own making. I've started to think that maybe this is just who I am now, a person who can't face his own life, who is paralyzed by fear and grief and the weight of his own failures. I used to be someone who could handle anything, who was known for his level-headedness and his ability to stay calm in a crisis. I was the person my friends called when they were in trouble, the one who could always figure out a solution, the one who kept his head when everyone else was losing theirs. Now I can barely get out of bed in the morning, and the thought of climbing a flight of stairs is enough to send me into a full-blown panic attack. I've become someone I don't recognize, someone who is failing at the most basic aspects of adult life, someone who can't even manage to fix a simple leak because he's too afraid of a room where a friend once died. I wonder sometimes what he would think if he could see me now, the friend he trusted, the one he'd helped so many times, reduced to this pathetic state. I think he'd be disappointed, maybe even angry, that I've let this experience break me in ways that I never imagined possible. I think he'd tell me to stop being so dramatic, to get up there and fix the damn leak, to get a tenant and get on with my life. I think he'd remind me that he was never one for sentimentality, that he would have hated being turned into a ghost that haunts my every waking moment. And I try to hold on to that thought, to use it as motivation, to channel his no-nonsense practicality and just get the job done. But then I remember those open eyes, staring at nothing, and the motivation evaporates like mist in the morning sun. I remember the stillness of his body, the way his hands were positioned on the blanket, the slight tilt of his head, the terrible emptiness that had replaced the warmth and humor that had defined him in life. I remember the sound of my own voice calling his name, the silence that answered me, the way the world seemed to tilt on its axis and never quite right itself again. I remember all of it, every detail, every sensory input, every emotion that I felt in those terrible moments, and I'm right back there, frozen in the doorway, unable to move forward or backward, trapped in a moment that I can't escape. I know that this can't continue. I know that I'm destroying myself, that my financial situation is unsustainable, that my mental health is deteriorating, that I'm letting the memory of a friend's death consume my entire existence. I know that I need to do something, anything, to break this cycle. But knowing and doing are two different things, and the gap between them feels like an infinite chasm that I don't have the strength to cross. I've started to consider the possibility that I might never get past this, that the trauma of finding him might permanently alter the course of my life, that I might never be able to feel comfortable in my own home again. I've started to wonder if I should just give up on the house, let it fall into foreclosure, walk away from everything and start over somewhere new. But the thought of abandoning the only home I've ever owned, of giving up on everything I've worked for, feels like another kind of death, one that I'm not sure I could survive. I've begun to think about death in ways I never did before, not just my own death, but the nature of it, the finality of it, the way it can transform a familiar space into something alien and terrifying. I think about how the apartment upstairs used to be such a comfortable place, full of warmth and laughter and the mundane rhythms of daily life, and now it's a place of dread and anxiety, a space that I can barely bring myself to enter. I think about how the memory of a life can be so powerful that it overwhelms everything else, making it impossible to see anything beyond the loss. I've started to understand why people move away from places where they've experienced trauma, why survivors of tragedy often need to physically separate themselves from the scenes of their suffering. I've started to understand why grief can be so paralyzing, why the weight of loss can feel like a physical burden that makes even the simplest tasks impossible. I've started to understand, in ways I never could have before, just how fragile we all are, how quickly the world can shift beneath our feet, how easily the familiar can become terrifying. And yet, there's a part of me that refuses to give up, a small voice that keeps whispering that I'm stronger than this, that I've survived worse, that I can find a way through. That voice tells me that my friend wouldn't want me to be destroyed by his death, that he'd want me to live my life fully and well, that the best way to honor his memory is to overcome this fear and move forward. That voice reminds me of all the times he helped me, all the ways he supported me, all the reasons I valued his friendship so deeply. That voice tells me that I owe it to him, and to myself, to find a way through this. But that voice is quiet, and the fear is loud. That voice is distant, and the grief is close. That voice is hope, and the weight of empty rooms is crushing.